Somewhere out there, collectors will swear to you, is a field where the United States Army buried its half-tracks. Rows of them, they say, driven into pits and covered over rather than handed to the Allies who needed them most. It is one of those stories that refuses to die, whispered at military vehicle shows and repeated in online forums for decades. But here is the question almost nobody asks. What if the real story is stranger than the myth? What if, instead of burying tens of thousands of these machines, the United States did something almost nobody expected? It gave them away, by the thousands, to armies on the other side of the world, and some of those very vehicles are still rolling today. To understand how a rumor about hidden graves grew out of one of the most sprawling weapons giveaways in history, you have to go back to the moment these machines were born, into a war that demanded something no army had ever needed before. By 1940, the United States Army had a problem that trucks and tanks alone could not solve. Trucks were fast but helpless off-road. Tanks could cross anything but were slow, expensive, and impossible to build fast enough. What the Army needed was something in between, a vehicle that could keep pace with armor, carry a full rifle squad, and still be built cheaply, quickly, in numbers no factory had ever attempted. The answer came from an unlikely place. Half-track designs the French had been experimenting with years earlier, adapted and re-engineered by the White Motor Company. The result was the M3 half-track, a machine with the front end of a truck and the rear of a tank, wheels up front for steering, tracks in back for chewing through mud, sand, and shattered roads that would have swallowed an ordinary vehicle whole. Production began in 1941, and it did not stop for 4 years. White Motor Company built them. So did Autocar. So did Diamond T. By the time the guns fell silent, close to 41,000 M3 half-tracks and their variants had rolled off American assembly lines, an almost unimaginable number of vehicles built for a single, brutal purpose. These were not garrison vehicles sitting quietly behind the lines. M3 half-tracks carried riflemen onto the beaches of North Africa, ground through the hedgerows of Normandy, and hauled anti-tank guns into position under fire on a dozen fronts. Some were converted into rolling anti-aircraft platforms, quad 50-caliber machine guns bristling from an open top, tearing enemy planes out of the sky before they could reach the men below. Others were stripped down and rebuilt as mobile command posts, ambulances, mortar carriers, or artillery tractors, hauling 3-inch anti-tank guns into position through terrain that would have stranded a wheeled truck in minutes. The design's simplicity was its genius, built from commercially available truck components wherever possible, so that a factory that had never built a military vehicle before could be retooled and turning out half-tracks within months, a decision that let American industry outproduce anything the Axis could match. Under Lend-Lease, thousands never even flew an American flag. They went straight to British Commonwealth forces fighting in the deserts of North Africa, where British troops nicknamed an early version Honey for how smoothly it ran even when undergunned. They went to the Free French, rebuilding an army out of exile. They went to the Soviet Red Army, arriving in Arctic convoys that braved U-boat-infested waters to reach men who desperately needed mobility as much as firepower, hauling supplies and troops across terrain the Wehrmacht's own vehicles frequently couldn't handle. By the middle of the war, the M3 had become one of the most widely distributed American vehicles on Earth, a quiet mechanical thread running through nearly every Allied army fighting the Axis, present at landings, retreats, and final offensives on every continent where the war was fought. And then, in the span of a few months in 1945, the war that had demanded all 41,000 of them simply stopped. 2 surrenders, 6 years apart in origin but separated by mere months in 1945, brought the largest industrial mobilization in human history to a halt almost overnight. Germany surrendered in May. Japan followed in August. Factories that had been running triple shifts to build engines, armor plate, and half-track hulls suddenly had no war left to feed. Assembly lines that once produced military vehicles by the thousand each month went silent within weeks. Soldiers who had spent years overseas began streaming home by the hundreds of thousands, and behind them, scattered across depots in Europe, the Pacific, and stateside storage yards, sat a surplus so enormous that nobody in Washington had a workable plan for what to do with it. Half-tracks that had carried men into battle now sat in long, silent rows, engines cold, waiting for orders that weren't coming. The problem wasn't losing the war. The problem was winning it, because victory had left the United States holding the largest inventory of surplus military hardware any nation had ever possessed. And every single day it sat there, it was costing money nobody wanted to keep spending. This is where the panic set in. Storage yards in Europe overflowed with vehicles that had rolled off transports only months earlier, still smelling of fresh paint and engine oil, now parked in rows that stretched farther than anyone wanted to walk. Depots in the Philippines and across the Pacific held equipment nobody had time to catalogue properly, let alone ship home, while officers who had spent years worrying about ammunition shortages now worried about something almost embarrassing by comparison: where to put everything. Every half-track sitting idle was a half-track that had to be guarded, maintained, insured against rust and theft, and eventually accounted for on a budget line that Congress wanted gone. Shipping vehicles back across the Atlantic or Pacific cost more, in many cases, than the vehicles themselves were worth on paper, and a government trying to demobilize 12 million service members simply did not have the ships, the manpower, or the patience to bring every piece of hardware home for a hero's welcome. Military planners who had spent years thinking only about how to win now faced an entirely different kind of war. A war against their own surplus, fought with paperwork instead of bullets. Vehicles were reclassified, reassigned, transferred between commands so many times that some records simply lost track of individual serial numbers. And it was in the middle of that chaos, in the confusion of 1945 and 1946, that the rumors first took root. Soldiers saw vehicles disappear from depots and never learn where they went. Equipment that couldn't be shipped or sold fast enough sometimes simply vanished from the paperwork trail, reassigned so many times that no single officer could say with certainty where a given half-track had ended up. And when people can't explain where something went, they invent an answer. For the half-track, that answer became burial. A story clean enough to repeat, dramatic enough to remember, and almost entirely wrong. But something else was happening at the same time, something far less mysterious and far more consequential than any buried field of vehicles. The world that had just finished fighting the Axis was already splitting into new sides. The Soviet Union, an ally in name only by 1946, was becoming the central fear of American planners. Western Europe lay in ruins, its own armies gutted, its factories destroyed, its ability to defend itself against a new threat nearly non-existent. Washington faced a choice that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with strategy. Scrap the surplus for scrap metal value, or use it to rebuild the military strength of allies who could not otherwise afford to rearm. The debate wasn't quiet. Some in the War Department argued for aggressive demobilization and disposal. Sell what you can, melt down the rest, and stop paying to guard machines nobody was using. Others argued the opposite, that giving away surplus equipment to friendly governments was cheaper, faster, and strategically smarter than either storing it indefinitely or destroying assets that could still fight. That second argument won, and it set in motion a policy that would define surplus disposal for the next decade. By 1949, that argument had a name and a budget behind it: the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, built to funnel American military hardware into the hands of the newly formed North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO itself had been founded that same year, a direct answer to the fear that Soviet tanks could roll across a defenseless Western Europe with almost nothing to stop them. And sitting in depots from New Jersey to the Philippines were tens of thousands of half-tracks that had already proven themselves in combat, machines that didn't need to be redesigned or re-engineered, only shipped and handed over. What followed was one of the largest transfers of surplus military hardware in modern history. M3 half-tracks and their M5 cousins went to Britain. They went to France, to Belgium, to the Netherlands, to Greece and Portugal. Some went further still, to Chile, to Brazil, to Mexico, to a long list of nations far from the battlefields where these vehicles had first seen combat. 20 countries by some counts eventually operated M3 or M2-derived half-tracks, a spread of ownership that stretched from Western Europe to South America to the Middle East. Before any of that surplus ever reached NATO's newest members, though, the half-track got one more American war. When North Korea crossed the 38th parallel in 1950, the Army discovered it still needed the mobile anti-aircraft firepower half-tracks provided, and demand for the Quad 50-armed M16 variant became so great that the government issued fresh contracts, not to build new vehicles from scratch, but to convert 1,662 M3A1 personnel carriers pulled straight out of storage into M16A1 gun carriages. Machines that had been sitting in a surplus yard, quite possibly candidates for scrapping only months earlier, were pulled back into frontline service almost overnight, their upper armor reworked to accommodate the higher gun mounts the conversion required. It is a detail almost nobody outside serious collectors knows. Some of the very half-tracks caught in the post-war surplus glut fought an entirely new war in Korea before they ever reached a NATO ally. And it is in the Middle East that the story takes its strangest turn. Israel, fighting for its survival in 1948 before the state was even a year old, received half-tracks that became core pieces of its earliest armored formations. These were not museum pieces handed over for prestige. They were combat vehicles, thrown immediately into a war for national survival, and they did not retire quietly afterward. Israeli engineers kept modifying and upgrading their half-track fleet for decades, cycling through variant after variant, right up through a final configuration, mounting twin 20mm cannons that remained in active service into the 21st century, meaning some of these vehicles, built to fight Nazi Germany, were still operational more than 60 years after the factories that made them had gone quiet. No burial pit produces that kind of afterlife. No hidden grave explains a vehicle still rolling into the 2000s. The truth was more remarkable than the rumor. Instead of disappearing into the ground, thousands of these half-tracks kept fighting, decade after decade, for nations that never could have afforded to build them from scratch. The spread went further than the Middle East and Western Europe alone. South American nations that had never fielded a serious mechanized force suddenly found themselves operating some of the same machines that had crossed the beaches at Normandy. Chile, Brazil, Mexico, and others took on half-tracks either purchased at surplus prices or transferred as part of broader hemispheric defense arrangements. Countries as far-flung as Portugal and Greece received them as founding NATO members, rebuilding militaries gutted by occupation and civil war. By the time the full scope of these transfers was complete, roughly 20 different nations had operated some version of the M2 or M3 family, an international footprint that no single depot burial, however large, could ever have replaced. That doesn't mean nothing was scrapped, and it doesn't mean the rumor came from nowhere. Some half-tracks genuinely were cut apart for scrap metal, their armor plate melted down alongside tanks and aircraft that were simply too obsolete or too damaged to be worth shipping anywhere. Others sat in storage yards for years, quietly cannibalized for parts until only a stripped hulk remained, eventually hauled away and forgotten. Depot record-keeping in the chaotic years right after the war was far from perfect, and vehicles genuinely did fall through administrative cracks, reassigned, redesignated, or simply lost in a system straining under the sheer volume of what it was trying to track. It is entirely possible that somewhere, in some overwhelmed depot, damaged or unusable half-tracks were bulldozed into pits rather than shipped anywhere at all, not as a deliberate national policy, but as one tired unit's fastest way to clear space. But a handful of scattered, undocumented local disposals is a world away from the myth that grew up around them, the idea that the Army made a considered choice to bury working vehicles instead of arming its own allies. The paperwork, the shipping manifests, the decades of continued service in a dozen foreign armies all point the other way entirely. So where did the rumor really come from? Likely from the same place most surplus disposal myths come from: the genuine strangeness of watching a war economy shut down almost overnight. Veterans came home to find the vehicles they had once depended on for their lives simply gone. No explanation offered. No farewell tour through a museum. Equipment that had been the most important machine in a soldier's world 1 month was scrapyard fodder or foreign aid cargo the next, shipped off to countries most Americans couldn't find on a map. That kind of abrupt disappearance breeds stories. It's easier to imagine a secret burial site than to picture your half-track quietly loaded onto a cargo ship bound for a NATO ally you'll never hear about again. The truth simply lacked the drama the rumor supplied, until you look closely enough to realize the truth was its own kind of remarkable. Because what actually happened to the M3 half-track wasn't disappearance. It was one of the largest and longest-running acts of military generosity, or, depending on how you look at it, cold strategic calculation in the history of American surplus disposal. Vehicles built to fight one war ended up defining the armored capability of nations across 3 continents, arming allies who could never have built comparable forces on their own, and in Israel's case, remaining in frontline service for longer than the Second World War itself lasted, ×4. The half-track story didn't end in a hidden pit in 1946. It ended decades later in a very different kind of grave. A museum display case, a private collector's garage, or in more than one country, a final decommissioning ceremony for a vehicle that had simply outlived every other machine built alongside it. There is a quieter irony buried in all of this, one that most people telling the burial legend never stop to consider. The very reason the myth feels believable is the same reason the truth is so easy to overlook. Both stories start from the same fact, that a staggering number of half-tracks simply disappeared from American depots within a few short years of the war's end. The myth assumes the disappearance meant destruction. The truth is that disappearance meant redistribution. Quietly, unglamorously, one shipping manifest and one foreign military aid agreement at a time, with no ceremony and almost no press coverage, because arming an ally with second-hand equipment was never going to make headlines the way winning a battle did. Paperwork doesn't make for a dramatic campfire story. A secret burial site does. That gap between the boring truth and the exciting rumor is exactly the space where a legend like this one grows. It's worth remembering, too, that not every half-track story ended in continued service. Plenty were scrapped outright, their steel melted down and turned into everything from farm equipment to rebar, feeding a post-war construction boom that needed raw materials more than it needed 40-year-old troop carriers. Others were stripped for spare parts to keep the surviving fleet running in whichever army had received them, cannibalized down to bare frames and left to rust in depot corners until someone finally hauled the remains away. None of that is as tidy a story as a hidden grave, but it's the far more accurate picture of what large-scale military demobilization actually looked like. Not one dramatic decision made in a single room, but thousands of small, unglamorous choices made across dozens of depots and years of paperwork, each one nudging surplus equipment towards scrap, storage, or a new flag. What makes the half-track's real story worth telling isn't just that it debunks a rumor, it's that the true version says something larger about how the post-war world was actually built. The vehicles that carried American and British troops across North Africa and Normandy became, within a few short years, the backbone of newly formed NATO militaries desperately trying to present a credible deterrent against a Soviet army that dwarfed them in size. They became the armored core of a brand new nation fighting for its existence in the Middle East. They fought a second American war in Korea, pulled from storage yards and rebuilt almost overnight. That is not the story of equipment discarded and forgotten. That is the story of a single vehicle design quietly shaping the military balance of power on 3 continents for decades after the war that created it had already become history. Today, surviving M3 half-tracks are treasured by collectors and preserved in museums across multiple continents, restored and maintained by people who understand exactly how remarkable their service record really is. Some sit gleaming under museum lights, restored down to the last rivet. Others remain in the hands of private collectors who spend years and small fortunes tracking down original parts, determined to keep a piece of this history running rather than let it become static behind glass. Either way, they represent something the burial myth never could. Not a story of waste and secrecy, but a story of an old war machine given a second life, fighting for causes far removed from the one it was built for. The next time you hear someone insist the army buried its half-tracks rather than give them to its allies, you'll know the real answer is almost the exact opposite, and it's a far better story. If this kind of hidden history is the kind of thing you want more of, you know what to do. Like this video, subscribe, and get ready, because the next untold story from the aftermath of the Second World War is already waiting, and it might be even stranger than this one.